Hello. In the video that follows, we're going to be looking at three particular issues, but there could be others, that intersect with gender. So we're going to be looking at issues around indigeneity, the Indigenous woman leader in educational organizations. We're going to be looking at issues around racialized individuals, Black leaders in the US, who are leaders in higher education, and their story and what we can learn from that. And we're also going to be looking at a historical piece by Jackie Blount. It actually won a national award in the US. It's a very, very interesting and I think quite a complex reading of the history of sexuality in intersection with gender in educational organizations and how that has affected and continues to affect, because I think as you read it, you'll recognize patterns that continue to exist in educational organizations. So I hope that you'll enjoy them, and I hope that the little mini lecture that follows will be helpful in your own reading and interpretation of these, I think, very important readings. In theme 6, we're going to be looking at gender and diversity in educational leadership. And the picture that I've chosen is actually, and if you remember the reading by Rebecca Coulter, this is Rebecca Coulter here. She and I taught a course at Walpole Island a few years ago now, where they had decided, based on a report that Rebecca and I did years prior to that, to develop leadership within the community. And so this group represents a group who came out of that particular Indigenous community, that particular First Nations community in southwestern Ontario, and they all graduated, every single one of them, in a master's program that pay particular attention to issues of leadership in educational organizations in First Nations communities. And so this was a day of great celebration, not only for this group of students, but for their community and for the university, who were very excited to see this initiative go forward and go forward so successfully, based on largely due to the efforts of a really wonderful group of students. Teachers, most of them in the school, some who were members of the board, etc. So they, in many ways, in my mind at least, represent what we're going to be talking about today. The authors that we're going to be looking at in this reading, and the three readings that we're going to be exploring, are Tanya Fitzgerald, who is from Ireland and works in Australia and works with Indigenous populations. So she definitely is a cross-cultural worker. And Tanya was invited to look at issues around women in leadership, Indigenous women in leadership, in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So her piece of work, I think, is a very interesting and important one in opening up an understanding of how these women and the intersection around gender and race plays itself out in the work that they do, and the very important work that they do. Jackie Blount is a historian. She's now at the University of I think she was at North Carolina, and I think she's at Ohio now. At any rate, she does really stellar work, particularly around sexuality and educational leadership. And because of her historical work, she's really brought a tremendous understanding to areas that had previously been largely unexplored. And then we have Jean-Marie Gatin, Williams, and Sherman, and I don't know any of them, but I did find a picture of Jean-Marie, who is at the University of Ohio, the University of Louisville. So she's in Kentucky. This group of authors looks at the experience of Black women's leadership and how these Black women experience leadership in higher education. So most of them are presidents or have senior administrative positions in higher education. So I think that their papers represent a nice broad cross-section of the kinds of experiences that we're wanting to look at in this theme. The critique of feminism for several years now has been that largely feminism came out of middle class white women's experience. And as a result, it reflects that experience to the exclusion of women who do not share that experience. So, immigrant women, Black women, Indigenous women, and so on. So, we have this critique that has moved forward and has been very powerful in rethinking and reshaping the contours and the work that feminism is doing. In all cases, however, the question becomes who are we fighting for? And so the answer to that is we're fighting for all women, and we're fighting against a kind of common set of enemies, some that affect other particular populations of women more than others. So certainly all are fighting against patriarchy and its implications for women in oppressing women and so on. Colonialism, so we have particularly immigrant women and women who come out of the global south are whose historical experience of colonialism has affected their own sense of themselves and their own history, is something that has become a very common discussion within feminist scholarship and certainly a critique of feminism. Class is an issue that has emerged particularly, I think, since the emergence of the New Right and the ways in which the New Right has imposed itself on economic systems and the kind of homogenizing effects of globalization and so on. Ableism is another one that many women are paying more attention to now, perhaps as we get older, and more of us are experiencing the challenges of not being as physically able and perhaps mentally able as we once were. Perhaps that's been part of the raising of awareness and consciousness of this issue, but it has become an important one, and one that is beginning to gain credence, and more work is being done. Homophobia is certainly one that is gaining a lot of attention, particularly in not particularly, but newly in educational leadership. And so we have people like Catherine Lugg, we have Jackie Blount and others who are doing some really important work in this area. So these are the people and the issues that we're fighting. But what questions then start to emerge when we start broadening the borders around feminism? So the question then becomes, can I speak for a lesbian Black woman, for example, if that's not my experience? So this has become a very lively debate. Whose voice can we speak with, and is it appropriate to appropriate other voices? So who does, should, and can the women's movement speak for? What do we mean by diversity? Do we mean diversity only of cultural experience, diversity of history, diversity of location, etc.? So there are all kinds of diversities that are being explored and need to be explored as we extend our understandings. How might we mediate and come to understand differing worldviews? And this becomes a very important question in the slides that will follow. So when we consider women, Indigenous women in particular, and their experience of leadership, they describe this experience as walking between two worlds. This reminds me of a story that was a storybook that I picked up several years ago now, written by a Métis author who talks, and it's called Two Pairs of Shoes. And it's the story of a little girl who's beginning school, and her mother has, and she's an Aboriginal young child, and her mother has gone into town and has bought her a beautiful pair of patent leather shoes. So she's so excited about these shoes, and so she puts them on and she runs to talk to her kokum, her grandmother, and show her her beautiful black patent leather shoes. And her kokum, who is blind and elderly and frail, she she tells her granddaughter, because it's difficult for her to do so, to go and find a box under her bed. And the little girl pulls it out, and inside the box is a beautiful pair of hand beaded leather moccasins. And she gives them to her granddaughter, and she says, as you move forward into school, it's important to know when and how to wear both pairs of shoes. And so it's such a beautiful analogy of this two-worldedness that Indigenous women find themselves occupying, whether they're teaching and leading in a school that's primarily Indigenous students, Aboriginal students, or whether it's in a regular public school with a population of Aboriginal students. In either case, these kinds of issues begin to emerge. And so Tanya Fitzgerald talks about this and talks about the tension between race and gender in these women's lives, and talks about how that road that they walk between honoring and expressing difference and assimilation and the dangers of assimilation, and yet the comfort of assimilation in living in a world that's dominated by white values, is one that is a very difficult and tenuous one for these women to navigate. Okay, so Indigenous women leaders, as she talks about them, and as what's I think important about this paper is their voices are predominant in it. As these women talk about their experience, they talk about stepping into a world that is gendered, where women teach and men lead. For most of us listening to that, we think, well, yes, that's my experience too. But oftentimes, particularly depending on the particular nation that we're talking about, they may be stepping from a matriarchal population and nation and community into one that reflects a different set of values. And so they're caught in between. Not always, because certainly not all Aboriginal communities would be matriarchal, but sometimes that's the tension. But nevertheless, they're stepping into this world, and it's gendered, but it's also raced. And it's also globalized. So Tanya Fitzgerald talks about globalization, which has pushed out the concerns of the local, which are at the heart of often what these Indigenous women leaders are paying attention to and are trying to bring to the forefront, so that they can work to transform possibilities for those students. And instead, they find themselves in a location where the global and the demands of the global marketplace are pushing all of that away and creating this much more homogeneous context for learning, for leading, and less room for diversity and difference. And so that road that they walk between the homogeneous and difference, assimilation and difference, is exacerbated in that kind of an environment. They're also caught between the needs of their local community, what their hopes and dreams of that community are, and the systems that they find themselves in that are driven by the global. So research on women in leadership has largely ignored women of color, and particularly Indigenous women. There's very little work, although it's starting to emerge. Annette Ani Benham, for example, a Hawaiian woman, an Indigenous Hawaiian woman, has done some interesting work. But there's not a huge amount of work up till now that's being done. Most of it has focused on issues around indigeneity rather than the intersection of indigeneity and gender. And particularly recognizing the worldviews that are shaped by different histories, cultures, traditions, and so on. So as a result of that lack of understanding in the dominant culture, these women often find themselves relegated to what Fitzgerald calls mammy work. That is, taking care of these Indigenous kids, taking care of these Aboriginal kids through various programs that provincial systems may put in place, for example. While they're doing that, they're under the watchful eye of two systems, of both the Aboriginal community, who's watching carefully to see that their children are being cared for in a way that is appropriate and in a way that they would condone. And they're also being measured by the standards of the white community. So they're caught between these two locations. And it can be a very challenging place to be. Likewise, we find in the paper that examines intersectionality of race and gender by Gatan et al., looks at this same phenomenon through the eyes of Black women who have become leaders in higher educational settings. And the authors use critical race theory, and they go into some description in the paper, so I won't take time to do that now. But it's a very interesting theoretical context because it looks at so it examines and challenges dominant discourses and educational structures. And it looks for places where Black leadership is marginalized, but also locations where emancipation is possible. So it's, rather than being a determinist kind of a perspective, it also is leaves room for agency for these women to act on their behalf. So in examining the intersectionality of race and gender, they argue that there's a need to recognize an Afrocentric epistemology. And in the paper that Fitzgerald writes, she talks about this as well. And this is key to understanding the location that these women occupy and their hopes and dreams for the work that they do. Because rather than bringing to their work a dominant epistemology, that is epistemology being how we understand what we know, how we know what we know. And how we know what we know comes largely out of our own experience. So I think I know a certain thing based on my historical experience, based on my cultural experience, based on my family experience, and so on. And so I bring that understanding to how I look at a particular phenomenon. So when one comes from a different historical location, a different cultural location, linguistic location, and so on, then that informs what you believe to be true about yourself and your experiences. And you bring that understanding then to the expression of leadership. They recognize and resist oppression resulting from colonialism, slavery, apartheid, imperialism, and other systems of racial domination. And they resist race and gender-based stereotypes. And in doing that, and in recognizing that that's occurring, they experience more questioning of their ability and their authority. They find themselves occupying a double outsider position with both men and women, because no matter which group you're interacting with, you are the other. So it is a kind of double outsider location that makes it difficult for the kind of networking and so on that's very important to leadership. Racial issues become particularly tricky to address. We see this, for example, in popular press. There's been a lot of discussion about how Obama is going to deal with racial issues and how he has dealt with racial issues. And sometimes he's the least able to speak because he's seen as having some kind of special interest rather than being able to speak frankly and in the way that one would expect a leader to do in dealing with these kinds of issues. They often have had to work twice as hard to get half as much, and they've had to reconcile themselves to that and work to resist that. The women in the study, all presidents of higher education institutions, represent the history of the racial and gender struggles in the US. And reading their stories, and again, their stories are preeminent in the paper, is such an interesting way to enter into a knowledge of that history. So the findings of this paper that reflect in many ways the findings of the Fitzgerald paper as well is experience is not homogeneous but represents a common history and context. So while they possess a common history and context, which actually is in resistance to a dominant culture, their own experience is not homogeneous. It's affected by different geographic locations, different nation locations. For example, a West Coast Aboriginal experience may be very different than a Southwestern Ontario Aboriginal experience, may be very different than an Alberta Aboriginal experience, and so on. So you know, this notion of homogeneity and difference is one of the key findings of both. Resilience and the ability to subvert injustice comes out of the very thing that they're resisting. That is, the strength that they've gained in the struggle against oppression. And that their leadership is oriented to consensus building and collaborative change, and represents, in many ways, a new model of leadership that can be highly informative to how we understand leadership in other contexts. Blount's paper, Manly Men and Womanly Women, and I love that title, looks at the very complex history of sexuality and how that gets expressed in educational organizations. And she talks for quite a bit of the paper about this conflicted position of single and married teachers and how that intersects with gender in very interesting and highly complex ways. So she talks about, in here we have a picture actually in Corinth, which is where my grandmother used to teach years and years ago. And this is prior to her time, but this would probably be about the time that she was going to school in that small town in southwestern Ontario. But the conflicted position of single and married teachers is one that has shifted over time. So there was a time, and I think I quote this actually in the paper, in an earlier paper in the course about conversation, conciliation, and conservation, conciliation, and conversation, where the inspector talks about being able to get these young teachers for young female teachers for twice as much as a more experienced male teacher. So they became this kind of commodity. So single female teachers were cheaper and they were expendable because oftentimes they got married and then they couldn't teach anymore because of the rules that applied. So as the economy shifted, for example, during the Great Depression, women were pushed out of teaching positions. When the World Wars ended and men were seeking positions, women again were pushed out of teaching positions. So it was kind of handy to have these young female single teachers in these positions because they were in some ways more expendable than married women, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because of course they were depending in many ways on their ability to earn a living. Nevertheless, that was the position that was taken. And they were, once they got married, they were required not to teach anymore. Married women teachers were seen as taking jobs away from both men and women. And after all, they had a man taking care of them, so therefore they didn't need a job, whereas young women did. So there were these kind of peculiar ways in which these questions were approached. However, men needed to be married because they needed to demonstrate right character. And of course, that spoke to their sexuality in the kind of more genteel parlance of the day. However, the fear of feminization, which we hear talked about a great deal these days. So history does indeed repeat itself. In the 1920s to the 1940s, there was seen to be a kind of masculinity crisis. So while men were going off to war and getting killed and so on, and then coming back and finding that they didn't have jobs, so there was this kind of crisis mentality around maleness. Marriage and birth rates were going down for economic reasons, as well as the fact that women were beginning to find employment and making decisions about whether they chose to marry or not. And women's suffrage. Women were making demands. They'd been, building the bombs, etc. during the war, and so why shouldn't they be able to vote, and so on. So this led to a perception that men were losing their traditional position of power. And so as a result of this kind of mentality, there was a seeking out of manly men who would stand against this feminization that was occurring. And we needed womanly women who would demonstrate the kind of womanliness that would lead to family life that would be more traditional and would put, in essence, women in their place. So single women were now positioned through discourses of the day as deviant, as dangerous, and needed to be pushed out of the profession of teaching and their influence on young children, while married men were seen as desirable, particularly for positions like the superintendency, to counteract feminization of education. So the marriage ban was dropped, and boards sought marriageable young women as teachers, who would demonstrate the kind of womanliness that was desired. Blount argues then for the importance of considering sexuality as an important category of analysis when considering inequity in school systems, and she makes a very, I think, strong case for this. She argues that history demonstrates that an environment that demands a high level of gender conformity and gender appropriate work has terrible consequences for all of us, but particularly for GLBTQ, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer educators and questioning educators, and the young people that they teach. And so we see through these three lenses of difference how we might expand the boundaries around how we think about women in leadership and how we might learn from one another and our differing experiences as we consider these issues. So I hope you found this informative. It's certainly an important topic, and I'm really looking forward to your input as you put your précis and your discussions on the forums. Thanks very much.